mostly on the revenue side, but actually a little bit on the expenses as well. So Elizabeth will present those alternative scenarios.
Thank you. As noted at the March budget workshop, the Finance Committee considered many of the primary assumptions built into the fiscal year 17 budget. You looked at this slide, and there were 4 that the Finance Committee asked that we go back and revise 5-year forecasts with some alternate assumptions, and we have those for you to consider this evening. The first 2 impact the general fund, and that was the property tax levy and the sales tax revenue assumption. As you can see, the property tax assumption had a 3.1, which was based on the 2015 levy approved, and then a 2.2, 2.5, 2.5, 2.5% increase assumption each year. We were asked to recalibrate that with a 3.0% assumption each year. And on the sales tax revenue, where we had a 2.5% growth assumption built in each year, we were asked to look at that flat. The third impacted the capital improvement fund. That was the real estate transfer tax. We had a 5% growth assumption built into the capital improvement fund 5-year forecast. We were asked to go back and look at that at a 1.5% assumption. And then finally, with the water utility fund, the water rate increase, we talked about the fact that it built in a 2.5% rate assumption, but was built on a 5-year rolling average of water sales. Because that included fiscal year 13, which, as you know, was the summer of 2012 when we had very hot, dry conditions, Finance Committee asked us to go back and recalculate the 5-year rolling average without that summer in it to see what that would do to the 5-year forecast. So looking first at the general fund, that was simply the 5-year forecast that we discussed at the March 14th meeting. The graph is easier to depict here. Once we built in the modified assumptions for the property tax and the sales tax, the line nearly mirrored the original. So I did provide this slide in your packet just so you could see the breakdown of the increase on the property tax side and the decrease on reducing the sales tax assumption. But as you can see at the bottom, the net change was essentially no impact overall on the 5-year forecast. So as far as the published budget book, we could use the March 14th assumptions, we could adjust only the property tax, we could adjust only the sales tax, or we can modify both. It would depend on the preference of the committee.
Does anybody have thoughts about that? What we essentially did with those 2 revenue adjustments is moved the revenue from sales tax to property tax, essentially. But that would require, or will require, ongoing attention from us as we go forward over the next 5 years with the tax levies. So what we did was this scenario basically says the economy will continue to go along kind of quietly. Sales taxes in the community have been flat to trending a little bit down. So let's not assume that they're going to go merrily along at 3% per year, and that we will have to continue to increase our share of the property taxes a little more rapidly than we might otherwise prefer. And Michelle?
George, when I think of, Chairman Pantaleone, when I think about these 2, I think about property taxes we have control over, sales taxes we don't, because we don't require people to buy a certain quantity. So I'm glad to know that they offset each other, because I think about them in that way. So I would suggest that we look at the sales tax revenue and its trend and hope that it is above what we have forecasted. And if it is, then 3% it can be lowered as a property tax increase.
Right.
And I think that's really what drove the analysis to begin with.
And the other side of that is, we still have that, if you could go back a couple of slides.
Absolutely.
To the graph, there, one slide.
Sorry.
Across.
We've now managed to push that magical moment where the lines cross out to 2019 from the first time we looked at this, I think it was 2016. So we keep succeeding in avoiding going into an operating deficit. We may not have the luxury, even if sales taxes do perform well, to hold off on the tax side.
Are you referring to state actions?
All kinds of things.
And
It could be that.
very-
That's the most obvious one, but there are other surprises out there in the economy. And we're 7 years into a recovery cycle. Chances are we're going to have some sort of a pullback here in the next couple of years, and that could affect everything, from property values, transfer taxes, so.
In that context, how do you look at real estate transfer taxes in the context of property and sales tax income?
It's not really controllable. I mean, I would put it in the same I'm just speaking for myself here. We've seen a pretty significant trend where the number of transactions is at, I believe it's been at a record level for the last year and a half or 2 years. But the revenue we're getting from it is significantly less because what everybody is observing is what we're feeling in our pocketbook, which is that there are more transactions happening at the lower end of the scale in town, and the higher cost properties, of which we have many, are not moving the way they used to. So, but I think it's pretty much of it ought to be a little more stable, but it did take a definite nosedive in 2009, 2010. So it's definitely it's susceptible to recessions.
And do we earmark those funds?
Those are earmarked for capital.
Thank you.
And we are, and we're constantly having to make difficult decisions about capital as well, so.
Right, right.
I
Other
agree with
thoughts?
Michelle. No, I think it's the right thing to do. I'd rather have the numbers reflect, even if they end up being about the same, it seems important that they reflect the reality of where we actually think the funds are going to be able to, where we can manage where they come from. So, and if we can persuade everybody to do a lot of shopping in town, which I think most of us try to do anyway, but maybe their sales revenue will improve.
Broader term, right. So I guess, is it safe to say that the direction from the Finance Committee is to go with these two alternate revenue assumptions, the flat sales tax and the
3%.
higher growth of property taxes?
So that's option 4, that's option 4, I guess.
And so the budget we bring back to the city council on May 2nd will actually reflect a reduction in anticipated revenues in FY17 of just under $69,000 to reflect this 0% assumption on sales tax.
Right.
Okay. Okay, the next fund is the capital fund, so segueing to the real estate transfer tax. This is the 5-year forecast that you saw in March with just the yellow change, the real estate transfer tax with a 1.5% growth assumption instead of 5%. And what is reflected at the bottom of the page is the change cumulatively over the period of time, over the 5-year period of time, in anticipated revenue and ending fund balance due to that change. So the good news is that it would not impact the annual funds available for the capital improvement program. It's still $3.75 million. However, at the end of the 5-year period, we're projecting a fund balance of just over $1 million instead of $1.8 million. So over the 5-year period, it had about a $800,000 difference in anticipated revenue.
Do you have the ability to pull up the chart that's in the flash report that shows the history of the real estate transfer tax?
I don't.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's the last page of the finance packet.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you go to the last page of this packet, it's,
There's the annual, it's going the wrong way.
it's been pretty much flat over its life. A little ups and a little downs, recently downs. So, that's, I think, gives some, and we've certainly seen a significant decline the last couple of years from this change in the market. So,
Well, finally, the average sales price is starting to go higher based on year-to-date 2016, so we may have a
Might get a little benefit.
little benefit, yeah.
Yeah, and what you have on this page only reflects residential transactions. It does not have the additional revenue from commercial transactions, which are sporadic and vary widely in dollar amounts. But you can see the high for residential transactions was FY08 with 1.4 million in annual revenue. And we're year-to-date, end of February, 900,000. So with only 2 months
2
left
months
in the
left.
fiscal year, we're still considerably lower than that high.
George, can't we operate the same way Michelle was suggesting that we would operate if there was a marked increase in the sales tax revenue, that we could make the adjustment if we needed to? Again, I think thinking of what we have control over in terms of our planning process and budgeting and what we don't, but I mean, we would obviously love to be pleasantly surprised by this coming in at a higher number, so. And then we could react accordingly, I would think.
Well, and there's
So it
an
seems
element
like
of the,
parallel kind
there's an element of the real estate transfer tax that, this is my personal opinion, but I think it bears itself out in reality, that you don't necessarily benefit from pushing that higher, because it has the effect of reducing people's incentive to sell and reducing people's incentive to buy, because you're effectively taxing the transaction. So, again, it's one we might be able to move around. I don't know if we wanted to somehow think about increasing it, but I don't know if we need a referendum for that. We would.
Yes, we would. Our authorization is for the 4% or the 400s. 4/10. Well, I'll get that decimal point right. That is our authorization. We would have to go back to the voters to get further approval.
Right.
So this number increases basically when more homes are sold
More homes are sold at higher prices.
at higher, but just more homes being sold even at this average price, doesn't that?
We've had more homes. Oh, yes, it would go up if more homes
I
were
mean, so
sold than today.
there are two ways that
Right.
this gets bigger. More homes are sold and
Values
and
go
the
up.
prices of the homes are higher. Yeah, well, okay. So we
Are there
can-
communities around us that have a real estate transfer tax? Because if it goes too high, people move to other communities.
In addition to the statewide transfer tax, home rule municipalities have the authority to do so. Many have that, not all do, and the percentage varies. I know Highland Park does, I think Lake Bluff does. And many of the North Shore communities do, but it's an individual decision on the part of the voters and corporate authorities of those municipalities.
3/10 seems to be the mean, so we're above the mean. Highland Park's at 5/10, and that's the upper end of the spectrum.
So, other thoughts about this subject? It sounds like maybe we're comfortable with the more conservative assumption about the real estate transfer tax?
So here,
Is that
go
a
with number
consensus?
2.
Yep.
Okay. So we'll adjust that as well. And the last is the water fund. And that, again, changes only the revenue line item. And so that, excluding FY13, recalculating the 5-year average of sales and based on the projected rate, you can see the annual effect the first year and then the cumulative effect over the 5 years. So again, it does not change funding available for the capital component of the water utility fund, which is a positive. It does reduce projected fund balance over the 5-year period, but not to anything that is below the minimum target. So I would gather we would be making the same change for water with the more conservative.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I'll turn that over to the council. I mean, now, maybe just quickly describe the dynamics here. We had this 2013 fiscal year, which we had a huge spike in revenue. And so what we've done here is we've excluded that year from the 5-year average,
Right.
which would happen naturally over time anyway, as we get to next 2018, which is next year
Right.
for us. But, yeah, okay, so that ends up with a more conservative assumption, and I think one that we're more comfortable with.
Right. Okay.
I have a question. Does the city have any way of capturing sales tax when Lake Forest residents buy retail online?
To the extent that it's collected by the online retailer, which I think in Illinois they're required to do. I've noticed most of my online transactions are getting taxed.
Because that's the biggest threat to our local retail sales tax, isn't it? The increase in online purchasing.
It's actually federally regulated. If they have an Illinois presence, they do have an Illinois sales tax component. If they do not, they are exempt.
Does that get distributed to each local community?
They are,
Or is that a pool that's divided?
I believe, if they are with an Illinois presence, it goes to the municipality that hosts that seller. It's not the purchaser, it's the seller that would be the collecting agency.
Can we get some clarity on that for a future meeting? Because I feel like that's a pretty, that's important. I think if we order things, so if I go in and order something from J. Crew, Williams-Sonoma, that store gets, even though they're getting it from someplace else, they get the credit, and I think we get the sales tax. At least that's how I justify those impulse expenditures, but,
I can tell you that's an issue that the retailers all deal with differently.
okay, so
There-
that's up
there's
to the
no
individual.
consensus,
Well,
right,
but it's
and-
worth asking, you know, I mean, I can go to my computer, or I can go to, I'd rather have my, you know, my Williams-Sonoma and Lake Forest get credit for that sale than, maybe we
Then
can
what if
get
you order
some,
online and pick up in the store?
yeah.
You know, that's another,
Yeah, okay, well, let's try to get some clarity on that, because here we are talking about trying to raise sales revenue, sales tax revenue. Let's be sure we're giving people accurate information about how they can do their part.
that's a good idea. But it is, having some reasonably close connection to the retailing world, it's,
yeah.
you talk to one retailer and they each
Different- well-
handle it differently.
You know, maybe we should share that information. I mean, you know, that's worth knowing. Maybe we can get something in the dialogue too, to clarify.
Or we could all just shop in Lake Forest exclusively, and then it would be a non-issue.
So those were our last remaining budget items. Those revisions will be made. Budget books will be distributed on Friday, and then the city council will consider approval of the budget on May 2nd.
All right, thank you.
Concludes my item.
Thank you, Elizabeth. The next item is purchasing directive, the proposed revisions to the purchasing directive.
There it is.
Going to be presented by Diane Hall, Assistant Director of Finance.
Okay, I was asked to form a purchasing committee with city staff to review our current purchasing directive and to ensure that the directive incorporates the changes to the city code that have been made, and to ensure that the directive incorporates the newly implemented federal grant guidelines. There are very specific purchasing requirements, and we had to make sure those were included. And also to streamline the process and make sure it conforms to current practices. And I'm just gonna go over some of the highlights because it's a very lengthy policy. We've added language to multiple sections of the policy just to reaffirm that any purchases over $20,000 need city council approval. We've also added language to make sure that language is included in city council write-ups to request a waiver of the purchasing procedures that are outlined in the directive. We've also added a new section covering service or installment contracts and the level of approvals that go along with those different contracts. I've added a special section just for grant funding. We do have a separate administrative directive that does cover the federal grants, and as a requirement, instead of changing the purchasing directive for all the different changes for the federals, we just referring just to that policy. In the city code, there's a section that it has a vendor list approval, and we added that particular language into the policy. And then we've added a section on online purchases so that city staff make sure they use vendors online that are secure vendors. And we've also increased the department flexibility for change orders on contracts up to $10,000, which would only equal up to a maximum of $2,000, providing the total project cost plus any change orders does not go over $20,000. If that change order increases that contract over $20,000, then the contract would need to be brought to City Council for approval. We've eliminated section 8.5. Purchases in this section have been incorporated to other areas of the policy. So it's not a service-specific section. You can use different sections within the policy now. Under that 8.5, there was an existing relationship exception, which was not in the other section that had exceptions. So we've moved that exception to 9.0, and with the clarification that if it is an exception, that it still needs city council approval if it's over $20,000. And then I've added some flow charts at the end for just so it's easier to go through the policy, because it's very lengthy and very confusing at times, so hopefully the charts will help.
I didn't get any of it until I saw the flow charts, and then it all made perfect sense.
So I'd be happy to answer any questions, because I know they didn't cover all the changes.
I was wondering, can you break down purchases into the different value categories? What % of total purchases are in the 20,000 or above category?
Percentage-wise, I'm not sure offhand on the percentages. I can get that for you.
It would be interesting to see it across all of the all of the breakpoints for decision-making.
Okay, I can do that.
And second question on the grants. Grants have special reporting requirements.
For the federal, there's the Uniform Grant Guidance, which are the federal requirements. They've increased the limit from $500,000 to $750,000, but it's cumulative of all federal grants for expenditures in a fiscal year. And there are specific purchasing requirements that would not necessarily go with some of our purchasing where an existing relationship or you have to go out for bid, and they have very specific regulations.
So how do you, in what system or how do you track those trigger points? Do you have an automated system that tracks those trigger points? And are there penalties if you fail to report properly?
If the city reaches $750,000, we're required to have a single audit, which is completed by our auditors. But we do, especially in the budgeting process, we do look for grant-specific expenditures, so we know to start watching those particular expenditures and make sure that the rules are followed.
Thank you.
I have a question about Michelle's first question. It's really a question for Michelle. Were you looking for that information to be presented on a dollar-weighted basis or on a transaction basis? In other words, when you say how many transactions, what percentage? Is it number of transactions or is it dollar value of transactions?
Number of transactions by dollar value category.
Okay. So,
And my interest is just to get a sense of, I expect that most are below 10,000 because those are probably more voluminous. But I'm just curious.
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have to review the check register every month, and I would say I don't know. I would say, yes, there are more smaller transactions, but some of the larger transactions on a dollar basis are much, much larger. So it's, it is sort of an interesting question. Other thoughts about the purchasing directive? Okay. Thank you, Diane. The next item on the agenda is other business. Do we have any other business that anybody would like to raise? for the Finance Committee? If not, I would just refer everybody to the flash report. And there was one item in the flash report that I actually wanted to raise. Anybody have any other observations from the flash report? In the memo, there's a comment, but two comments, actually. One is just an observation. The fire and police pension plans have had, now this is, I believe, an artifact of the January swoon that the stock market took, and may have corrected, that was my question, is there's a reference to some pretty poor investment results that are negatively affecting the funding level of the two plans. Both plans were frankly not in the best funding condition before. So I guess my question is, given that the stock market has now rebounded to its prior heights, has there been a recovery, or is this mostly on the fixed income side where that recovery really hasn't happened?
The numbers you're seeing in the flash report are at the end of February, and there was very little rebounding in February. We don't have March reports yet from the pension fund accountants, so we'll just continue to monitor it. But
I get confused between the two plans, but I know one of them has very restrictive investment parameters.
police and fire they both have the same statutory requirements. Over time, one has been a little more conservative than the other, but now their portfolios are very similar between equities and fixed income.
Oh, they are, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question was a comment about declines in Oasis sales tax revenues. And I know there's been some issues with getting that distributed because I guess it's collected by Matawa and then we have a boundary agreement that we share. Is that an artifact of the process of allocating it back to us, or is that actual reductions in sales? And if so, what's the, is it because of oil prices?
There are actually two issues. One is a timing issue in that the Department of Revenue used to give Matawa reports every calendar quarter, so every 3 months. And so we would receive payments from Matawa every 3 months. Department of Revenue will now only provide those every 4 months. So after April, after August, and after December. So it changed the timing of receipts for us. So that was one factor where it was more of a deferral of the revenue and not so much an impact on the revenue from an accrual standpoint.
Right.
The second is that both Matawa and Lake Forest have had questions over the last year to year and a half regarding the reported data that we've received regarding Oasis sales tax revenues. And Matawa has indicated that they really exhausted all means in trying to analyze the differences and in talking with the Illinois Department of Revenue. The biggest factors are the decline in gasoline prices, which has been significant and resulted in significant reductions in the revenue, as well as one taxpayer there who had a multi-year audit that resulted in a negative adjustment that went back several years, and so that hit the current year revenue as an adjustment and reduction. So that's kind of a one-year anomaly that's really taking care of overpayments in prior years.
Other questions? Okay, thank you. The next item on the agenda is opportunity for the public to address the Finance Committee. I always say this at this moment, that we have a city council meeting coming up, so there'll be other opportunities for public comment, but if there's something specific to the Finance Committee agenda, or anything else for that matter, that belongs in the purview of the Finance Committee, any member of the public is welcome to bring up any such issues. Okay, there being none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn the Finance Committee.
So move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Council will begin in approximately 10 minutes, about 7:10.